Hi, I'm Rob, N1NUG, and today we're in my backyard to do some side-by-side antenna testing. Now, in case you haven't been following along with my channel over the last couple of months, I've been experimenting on and off with what I'll call a modified delta loop for portable use. The idea I came up with was to have a sort of lazy delta loop that's supported on one end using a 31-foot jacklight pole and kind of mounted at the other where the feed point is, very similar to the way you'd set up an end-fed half-wave. And I've had sort of mixed success with it so far. It works, but I don't know if it works any better than an end-fed half-wave. So what I decided to do today was to try and set the antennas up side by side and see if I could tell if there's any kind of appreciable difference between the two. My goal here today is to just look at both antennas as objectively as I can and understand what the differences between them are so that I can determine which one I want to use going forward for various scenarios. Now, I'll also mention that this is as scientific a test as I can make it, and that's to say, not really scientific at all. Now, both antennas are set up in my backyard and they're both parallel to each other. They're both supported with 31-foot jacklight poles, and they are both fed with 30 feet of RG8X coax that is the same age and was prepared the same way. So in other words, I've tried to make the antennas as equal as I can for this test with the materials I have hanging around. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let me show you these antennas closer up so you can get an idea of the details of their configuration and setup. I've done detailed videos about how I constructed and tested this antenna in previous videos. I'll link those down below if you want to check them out. But for right now, I'll give you a quick overview of what we're dealing with here. The delta loop is fed with a 4:1 LDG balun, and again, I've got the 30 feet of coax going off over that way. You can see the balun is supported on this rope hanging off of that 4-foot military pole that's set up right there. And then you can see the two delta loop wires diverge and go off that way. This one over here goes sort of to the bottom and parallels the ground, and at its lowest point is maybe about 12 inches or maybe about 8 inches off the ground where the wire sags. This wire, which is sort of the hypotenuse of the triangle, goes up to the top of the jacklight pole over there. If we take a look at the far end of the delta loop, you can see I've got my jacklight pole supported with 3 guy ropes and a clamp to hold everything. And then here, down here, is where you can see the bottom leg of the delta loop comes through and then makes a turn where this loop of rope is, and then goes not quite straight up to the top of the pole where it's pretty well bent over, and then the hypotenuse of the delta loop goes back over there to the feed point. Now, as I mentioned, the bottom wire of the delta loop is off the ground a bit. It's not touching the ground anywhere here. It's, like I said, maybe 8 inches or so, maybe 6 inches off the ground where the wire kind of sags as it goes over to the feed point. The far ends of both antennas are up a little bit of a slope in my backyard from where the feed point is. I'm guessing we're 3 to 4 feet higher at this end of the antenna than we are at the feed point. And that's about the best I could get to horizontal ground with both antennas set up at the same time. My backyard isn't really level except in one spot, and there's not enough room over there to have both antennas kind of set up together. So we're just gonna have to deal with this little bit of a slope. I don't think it's really gonna affect anything. So about 30 feet over from the other antenna and parallel to it is my end-fed half-wave. And I've set it up very similar to the way I've set up the delta loop. We've got the military pole here supporting one end and a jacklight pole on the far end supporting the high end of the antenna. Now, this antenna is the Reliance Antennas end-fed half-wave bug-out cut for 40 meters. This is just some silicone wire, and as I said, it just goes off to the jacklight pole on the far end like a typical end-fed half-wave antenna does. And again, just like the other antenna, it's fed with 30 feet of the RG8X coax going over that way. Over here at the far end of the end-fed half-wave, we've got another 31-foot jacklight pole that's set up and configured almost identically to what we've got on the delta loop. Now, in the case of the end-fed half-wave, the far end of it here is probably a little bit higher up than what the Delta Loop is, partially because this wire is thinner and lighter, but also there's less force on the jackknife pole, so it's not bending it over as much. And also it's attached directly to the tip of the jackknife pole, whereas the Delta Loop has sort of a support bracket that's down about 12 inches in the first place, and then it's bent over more. So that means the end fed half wave does have a slight height advantage up here at the tip. I don't know if that's really going to make much of a difference, but it is a difference, and one that I really can't work around with what I've got here. In other words, it is what it is. It's a little hard to give you the perspective here, but what I've done is I've taken the coax from the feed point of each antenna. One's over there and one's over there behind me. And I've brought them at sort of a 45-degree angle from the feed point back towards the far end of each of the antennas, which is behind you over there. And right here, sort of in the middle, where the feed points meet, is where I'm going to do my first few tests. Now eventually we're going to run some coax into the shack, which is just over there, and we'll complete the tests using some of the equipment in there. But I wanted to do a few tests out here first because I don't have enough coax to run into the shack and a point where I can switch it from inside. I have to do all the switching out here. So for that reason, I want to do our first few tests out here where we can kind of switch in real time back and forth. And then later on we'll move into the shack and do what I'll call more sophisticated testing. And then I'll just have to run in and out and flip the switch between tests. So this switch is kind of on the old side. I got it from my ham radio club when we had an auction a few years back, but it seems to work just fine. It's actually a pretty high quality switch, all things considered. But on the back you can see the two antennas, and I've got a short piece of coax on it right now that's going to go off to my radio and my analyzer. Now speaking of analyzer, let's look at that first. I'm going to apologize in advance for sort of the blurry images here. I really should have just grabbed an SD card, popped it into the Nano VNA, and saved the images directly. But for whatever reason, I didn't think to do that. So you're stuck with cell phone photos here. So I took a look at the end-fed half wave first. And you can see from this shot, we're looking at 40 meters, and we have an SWR of about 1.6 at 7.050 megahertz. Now, unfortunately, I didn't grab a screenshot of this, but I did move the cursor up so that I was looking at the SWR in the voice portion of the 40 meter band, and I think the SWR was up around 1.8 or so at those frequencies. So what that really means is that the antenna is best in the CW and data portion of the band, and a little bit high in the voice portion, but not a big deal for this test. Next, I moved up to 20 meters and checked the SWR there, and it's very much the same as the 40 meter band. SWR is 1.2 at the low end of the band, 14.07, and if I recall, when I moved up into the voice portion, it was up around 1.5 or 1.6. So tuned a little bit better on 20 meters, but still cut for the low end of the band. On 15 meters, the end-fed half wave looks like it's best in the voice portion of the band, which is what we want. On 10 meters, the end-fed half wave is best just a little bit above the normal sideband voice portion, at least the general portion of the band. Just like on 40 and 20, when I moved the cursor to check the SWR in sort of the desired part of the band, which is around 28.4 megahertz, SWR was somewhere around 1.6, 1.7. Now let's take a look at the SWR curve for the Delta Loop. Starting on 40 meters, you can see that the antenna is best right around 7.6 megahertz, so that's a little bit outside the ham band. And you can see that the SWR is still high there at roughly 2.2. I think when I moved the cursor into the voice portion of the 40 meter band, I was seeing somewhere around 2.5 SWR. So higher than the end-fed half wave, but still usable, at least for this test. Although in normal practice, that's probably where I would have either tried to retune the antenna or maybe brought in an antenna tuner to touch that up. On 40 meters, we're looking at the same thing. SWR is best a little bit above the band at 1.083, so pretty low actually. But when I checked the voice portion of 20 meters, it was around 1.5, so perfectly usable there. On 15 meters, the Delta Loop is actually cut a little bit lower than we'd really want at 22.17. When I moved the cursor into the voice portion for 15 meters, I think we were looking at an SWR around 2.1, 2.2, something like that. And lastly, on 10 meters, the Delta Loop is best around the FM portion of the 10-meter band. And when I moved the cursor into the sideband general portion down low, around 28.4, I think again we were seeing an SWR around 2 or so. As you saw, there is a little bit of a difference between the way the antennas are tuned, which may skew the results a little bit. It seems like the delta loop is cut just a little bit short, and the end-fed half wave is pretty close, maybe a little bit long. And we're not going to be using a tuner for this test, so the results may be skewed just a little bit, especially on transmit. I don't think it's going to affect receive as much. Anyway, what I want to do right now is just sort of a subjective test. I'm going to sit here with my FT891, kind of like we would do on a POTA activation, and just switch between the two antennas and see what happens as we kind of tune around. We're going to start off on 40 meters, and the first thing I'm going to do is tune to what I'll call an empty frequency, and then I'm going to switch between the two antennas. You're going to be able to hear a definite difference in sort of the noise level between the end-fed half wave and the delta loop. Starting off with the end-fed half wave, you can see that we're getting about an S3 noise floor, and you can kind of hear the static in the microphone. Now I'm going to switch to the loop, and you can see the noise level has gone down. Well, if somebody stops tuning up, the noise level has gone down to S1, and there was a noticeable drop in the audible static between the two. I'll switch back and forth a couple times and let you guys see and hear it. End-fed half wave, delta loop. End-fed half wave, delta loop. I found a net going on 7209. Signals are pretty strong, but when I switch between the antennas, I can definitely see a difference in the signals.
Not Western Mass, Northern Mass, I'm in Southern Mass near Rhode Island, but I am in Massachusetts.
End-fed half
a little
wave.
small 5 square mile town,
Delta loop.
little rectangle on the Rhode Island border, but no, not me. I was
End-fed half
I
wave.
just asking because Billy had to
loop.
give me the relay, but one of them was.
I found some weaker signals here. Let's do the same test and see what happens.
Yeah, I've upgraded my license.
End-fed half wave.
So thinking about waiting
Delta
for that
loop.
new icon to come out and getting that radio and that amplifier. That just kind of makes me melt
End-fed.
there a little bit. I'm not sure how much better it is from the 7300, but
Delta.
we'll see what happens. Maybe I'll do it, maybe I won't.
On that test, I still saw a little bit of a difference in signal level, but what I noticed about that one is that even though on the delta loop the signal level was a little bit lower, I could tell that the signal to noise ratio was much better, and the signals sounded better, a little bit easier to copy, I guess. So let's do some more testing. I found a Parks on the Air station here, although the band's a little bit crowded. Let's see if we can do the A/B test here and notice a difference. End-fed half wave.
Okay, got it. Kilo Charlie 1, Whiskey Tango Romeo. Yeah, I got you about a 4 or 5 or so here into my pocket. US 2267 in Indiana. Go ahead.
It might have been a little bit hard to pick out of the background noise there, but to me it sounded like the POTA station was a little bit stronger on the delta loop in this case, and the background noise was noticeably less, but not considerably less. I've got another POTA station on 20 meters. Let's try the A/B test on this and see what we see.
Hey, thanks for the
End-fed half wave.
Victor, I'm sorry, Kilo 8 Victor
Delta.
after November, Kilo 8 VON.
November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, November Uniform Golf, 5 and 8, 5-8.
QSL, you are 5-5 here in Connecticut. Wondering if you would mind helping me out with an antenna test here if you have a minute.
I do, go ahead.
Okay, so this antenna here is an end-fed half wave, and I think you said I was 5'8"?
You were 5'8".
Okay, I've switched over to a delta loop. How do I sound on this one?
You dropped down to a 5'6", 5'7". Still sound good.
Okay, very good. Hey, thanks for doing a test with me. Appreciate that, and good luck on your activation today. 7-3.
Hey, 73 Robert, good to hear you again. Other station in there, go ahead. That's Kilo 8 Alpha, it's Alpha.
November 1, November Uniform Golf.
November 1, November Uniform Golf. About a 57 here in Michigan.
Okay, QSL, you're about 5'3" here into Connecticut on my NFED half wave. Do you have a minute to test an antenna with me?
Oh, hey, that's what I'm here for. Just having fun, so sure. Go for it.
Okay, I've switched over to a different antenna. This is a Delta Loop. How do you hear me now?
Switch back to the other one. You dropped a little bit. You switch back and see if you pick up.
Okay, how do I sound now? I'm back on the NFED half wave.
You're better on the NFED, which is kind of weird. At my home, which is just about a mile from here, I have a loop. It's a 80-meter loop up about, electrically it's about 50 feet. And it always outperforms the NFED. So, a little different from my experience, but you're definitely better on the NFED there, old man.
Okay, very good. Good to know. The loop I'm using is a bit of a modified, compromised loop, so I'm not surprised. I also don't know what the pattern is. You could just be in a null. But either way, thanks for the test, and good luck on your activation.
73 from W6 Mike, QRZ.
November 1, November Uniform Golf.
You're 57 in the Kansas here this afternoon with Route 66 on the air, W6 Mike. Name here is Marion, over.
Okay, QSL Marion, thanks. You're 5'3" here in Connecticut. I'm wondering if you have a minute for me to do an antenna test. Do you have a minute?
Sure, no problem. Using a vertical here. You're readable. We'll see if it enhances your signal. Go ahead.
Okay, QSL, the antenna here right now is an NFED half wave. On my next transmission, I'll switch to a Delta Loop, and we'll see if it's any different. Okay, here's the Delta Loop. Do you notice any difference? Am I stronger or weaker?
Amazingly, you're weaker. That's unusual, but the NFED sounds better.
Okay, QSL. Yeah, the Delta Loop is a little bit of a kind of a modified Delta Loop. It's not quite to normal specs, so I'm actually not surprised. But yeah, thanks for the test. Appreciate you being out there, and good luck with your special event. 73.
73, thanks for participating in the Route 66 this year.
CQ Park Summer, from Kilo 3 India Whiskey India, calling CQ, standing by and listening. Number 1, November Uniform Golf, good afternoon, 5'9" in Pennsylvania today.
QSL, you're 5'5" here into Connecticut. Do you have a minute to do an antenna test with me?
Sure, tell me what you need.
Okay, right now I'm on an NFED half wave. Next transmission I'll switch over to a Delta Loop, and just let me know if my signal drops or comes up. Okay, I've switched over to the Delta Loop. What do you think of this one?
Pretty similar. I think the first one was a little cleaner, a little more quieting.
Okay, very good. Yeah, thanks. You actually sound a bit better on the Delta Loop because the background noise gets cut. But okay, hey, thanks for the test today, and good luck on your activation.
Thanks very much. And I was going to say, between the two, it's not a significant difference, just a tiny difference. So if one works better for you, that sounds like the one.
So it looks like the results of our subjective tests favor the NFED half wave. Most of the stations that I was able to contact said that I was noticeably stronger on the NFED half wave than I was on the Delta Loop. Having said that, on the receive side, signals were measurably lower, at least according to the S meter on the 891, although my ear tells me that the signal to noise ratio was better on the Delta Loop than it was on the NFED. There were a few times where, even though the signal was weaker, it was a little easier to copy because the background noise was weaker than what it would be on the NFED half wave. So having said all that, I think it's time to try a little bit more of an objective test. What I'm going to do is run some coax into the shack, and we're going to try a whisper test or maybe an FT8 test and see what we get there. As I mentioned earlier in the video, I don't have enough coax to run feed line to both antennas and into the shack. So I'm going to keep the same 30-foot feed line and the same switch out here in the yard, and then run about 75 feet of coax into the shack from there. The setup here in the shack is fairly straightforward. I've got the coax coming in from outside just through a window temporarily over here. And we're connected up to my FTDX10 right there, which in turn is connected up to the computer. We're going to fire up WSJTX and run some whisper tests using this setup and see what we get. So I first started off by testing the antenna's receive capability. I started on 40 meters, hooked up the end-fed half-wave, and ran 3 receive cycles in WSJTX and uploaded my spots to the WhisperNet site. I would then turn off the upload and wait 10 minutes so that the results would kind of purge themselves out of WhisperNet. I'd then switch over to the other antenna, in this case the Delta Loop, and then I would repeat the same thing. I would receive for 3 cycles, let the spots upload to WhisperNet, and then captured all of the results using screenshots. And I did this for 40 meters, 20 meters, 15, and 10 meters. And I did this over the course of a few hours, sort of in the middle of the day, between somewhere around 10 a.m. and 2 p.m. I know that even in that span of time, we can have changing band conditions and that kind of a thing, but what I'm hoping is that the band stayed relatively stable within the amount of time it took me to test each band. So in the example of my 40 meter test, we hooked up the end-fed half-wave, received for 6 minutes, paused for 10, hooked up the Delta Loop, and then received for 6 more minutes. So I'm hoping in that time span, the band didn't change too much and affect the results, although it is possible. The real way to test this would be over the course of several months or maybe even several years. And we, of course, don't have that kind of time. That's why I said at the beginning, this isn't really a scientific test, but it's about as close as we can get for a YouTube video. Anyway, having said all that, let's go through the results. They're kind of interesting. Here's a look at the receive results on 40 meters using the end-fed half-wave. You can see that there's a bit of a pattern that's emerged here. There's a bunch of stations to my northeast and a bunch of stations to my southwest, and nothing sort of directly north. And of course, there wouldn't be anything directly south since this is all ocean over here. If I move over to the Delta Loop, you can see that we've got a few more stations and the pattern is a little more evenly distributed, although there's a little bit of a gap up here. Now, another thing that's interesting is that with the Delta Loop, we've got a lot more of these sort of close-in stations within 3, 4, maybe 500 miles, where with the end-fed half-wave, especially to the southwest, we had a few more stations a little bit further out. Here's a look at the results on the end-fed on 20 meters. You can see we've got sort of a similar pattern, but we've got stations a little bit further away to the northeast, one over here in the UK, one up here in Newfoundland, and then a bunch again to the southwest. Now, if we take a look at the Delta Loop, you can see we've got the same stations sort of to the northeast, but we've got more stations to the southwest, and even a few over here sort of on the west coast. If we look at the 15 meter results for the end-fed half-wave, you can see that most of the stuff we're receiving is over here in Central Europe, with one station over here in Russia, and one lonely station down here in Florida. This time on the Delta Loop, we have fewer stations, just a couple over here in Central Europe. We've got that same station over in Moscow, but now we're hearing one station in Turkey as well. If we take a look at the results for the end-fed half-wave, aside from this one close station over here that must be on Cape Cod, we've got a handful over here in Europe again and one in Turkey. And then if we look at the Delta Loop, we've got one kind of close station. I don't see the call because my own is covering it up. And then we've got a cluster of stations over here in England and then that one in Turkey again. So those were some interesting results and not exactly what I expected based on the tests we did out in the yard with the POTA stations. It looks like on 40 and 20 meters, the Delta Loop may have a little bit of an advantage over the end-fed half-wave, or at least it did on that day. The Delta Loop seemed to receive more stations, and in the case of 20 meters, it was able to grab what I'll call those double hop stations out on the west coast, whereas the end-fed half-wave didn't hear them. Now, as I said earlier, the band conditions could have changed rapidly within the span of the 20 minutes or so that receive test took, and things might have just been a little bit better on the band by the time I switched over to the Delta Loop. When we look at the results for 15 and 10 meters, it's pretty clear that the end-fed half-wave was outperforming the Delta Loop a little bit. it was receiving more stations further away. Again, can we attribute that to changing band conditions? Or is the end-fed just a little bit better on the higher bands? So next I decided I wanted to try a transmit test on both antennas. So I approached it kind of the same way. And what that means is that the radio would transmit on the first cycle, rest on the second, and then transmit again on the third cycle. I then went over to WhisperNet and grabbed the results from the map. Let's take a look. Here's a look at the end-fed half-wave transmit results. You can see we've got a fair number of stations, with most of them being within, I don't know, 300, 400, maybe 500 miles. And we've got a few outliers down here along the edges. But it looks like the pattern is fairly uniform. If we take a look at the delta loop results, we can see a definite difference. There's not as many stations, and it looks like there's a definite null over here to the west and to the northeast, and maybe even directly to the east for those close-in stations that we saw on the end-fed half-wave. Although we are still getting a few outliers over here, sort of to the northwest, that we also saw on the end-fed half-wave. Here's what things look like on 20 meters for the end-fed half-wave. Nobody to the northeast or east is hearing us, but you can see a fair number of stations sort of to the southwest are picking us up, and then a handful over here on the west coast. If we take a look at the delta loop, the pattern is similar, although it seems like it's skewed a little bit further to the southwest and maybe a little closer in. A few less stations are hearing us in this direction, although we still seem to be making the same stations on the west coast with the delta loop that we were with the end-fed half-wave, and then one new one here up in the upper Midwest. Here are the results for 15 meters on the end-fed half-wave. You can see we're doing pretty good into Europe. A fair number of stations are hearing us there. One over here in the Canary Islands, and then just a couple out to the west and southwest in the US. Here are the transmit results for the delta loop on 15 meters. You can see we're getting Canary Islands like we were before, and a handful of stations in Europe. And then looking to the western US, it looks like we've got just a couple of stations here in a slightly different pattern than what we saw on the end-fed half-wave. So the transmit test for the end-fed half-wave on 10 meters shows a handful of stations over here in Europe picking us up, nothing in the western United States, and then of course we have this one outlier down here in Antarctica. Not sure if that's real or not, but if it is, that's pretty cool. And then over here on the delta loop, the pattern is similar, but about half the number of stations appear to be hearing us than were on the end-fed half-wave. And this time on the delta loop, it looks like the southern station that's picking us up is in Brazil rather than Antarctica. So the results of that transmit test are pretty interesting. In most cases, it looks like double the amount of stations are hearing us on the end-fed half-wave over the delta loop. So maybe that means the delta loop is a far better receive antenna than it is a transmit antenna, at least in this configuration. But this isn't where I stopped testing. Let me explain. So it's actually been a couple of days since I did the first test. I decided I wanted to try and spin the antennas around 90 degrees in the yard. Now I know that band conditions can change from hour to hour and most certainly day to day, so we could have completely different band conditions today than we did 2 days ago. I still thought it might be worthwhile to do the test and try to compare the trends in the data as opposed to, the exact data points that we're collecting. So to try and give you some sense of the way the antennas are oriented now, the delta loop endpoint is in the same exact location it was for the first test. I just took the feed point and spun it around 90 degrees to over here, pretty much where the high point of the end-fed was in the last test. So then I took the end-fed half-wave and I moved it so that the feed point is right over there off the end of the deck, pretty much even with the feed point for the delta loop. And then the far end of the end-fed is over there by the fence on the other side of the tree. So what that means is both antennas are still parallel to each other, but they are separated a little bit more now than they were in the last configuration. So if there was any interaction between them in the last test, hopefully it's a little bit less in this test. But other than that, hopefully we've got everything as similar as we can to the original test. As I mentioned earlier, This set of tests took place 2 days after the first set. So that means band conditions could be affecting results in addition to the antenna orientation change. Having said that, let's take a look at our receive results on 40 meters with the end-fed half wave. You can see that we're getting mostly stations within 300 to 400 miles. We've got a handful here to the southwest, a couple up here sort of to the north-northwest, and then a few to the northeast. If we take a look at the results from the Delta loop, it looks like the pattern is similar, but again, we're seeing more stations received on 40 meters. Looking at the receive results for 20 meters on the end-fed half wave, you can see that we've got a fair number of stations sort of to the west and southwest on the US, and a couple over here in the UK. And then we've got this one outlier down here in the South Pacific. I'm not sure what that's all about. On the Delta loop on 20 meters, you can see that we're getting, again, a similar pattern to what we saw in the end-fed, but fewer stations and probably closer in. We're not seeing that outlier in the South Pacific, and we're seeing a few stations over here sort of to the west that we weren't seeing on the end-fed half wave. On the end-fed half wave for 15 meters, you can see that we've got a few stations to the west and southwest in the US, and then a handful over here in Europe. On the Delta loop, we've got dramatically different results. We've only got one station here to my southwest, and one over here in the middle of Europe. I'm not sure what happened here. Maybe the band took a dive in the middle of this test. I'm not really sure. On 10 meters for the end-fed half wave, you can see we've got a cluster of stations out here in the southwest of the US, and a cluster over here in Europe, and a couple in the UK. And then for the Delta loop on 10 meters, things are looking kind of similar to the end-fed as far as reception to the southwest goes, but we've definitely got fewer stations coming in from Europe. Although we do have this one in Turkey that we didn't see on the end-fed half wave. With the new antenna orientation, the receive tests are similar in nature to what we saw the first time around. We're maybe getting a little bit of a different pattern now, which is to be expected since the antennas are oriented differently, but the performance of one versus the other seems about the same. The notable differences this time is that the Delta loop seemed to not perform quite as well as the end-fed half wave on 20 meters, whereas in the original test it was equal or maybe a little better. And also on 15 meters, the Delta loop seemed to be relatively deaf. But again, I don't know if the band took a dive while we were doing the Delta loop test on 15 meters. Hard to say. I'm going to call that inconclusive. So now let's take a look at the transmit results and see what those look like. Here's what the 40 meter end-fed looks like on transmit. You can see we've got stations out to maybe 500 or 600 miles. We got one outlier here in Michigan, and we've got a noticeable gap in the pattern over here sort of to the due west. If we take a look at the results for the Delta loop, things look pretty similar, although maybe a few less stations and closer in stations. But we are seeing that same gap in the pattern over here to the due west. Here's what the end-fed half wave looks like on 20 meters. We've got a handful of stations over here in Europe that are hearing us, and then we've got a good number of stations over here in the Midwest and the Southeast, and even a couple up here into the Northwest that are hearing us. If we look at the results from the Delta loop on 20 meters, it looks like we're getting similar results into Europe, maybe one or two more stations hearing us. And then over in the US, I think we're getting about the same number of stations, maybe a couple of more, and a few sort of in the middle of the country that are hearing us that were not on the end-fed half wave. However, I did notice that there were a few stations in the deep south that heard us on the end-fed, but they're not hearing us on the Delta loop. As you can see, on 15 meters, we're getting into Europe pretty well with the end-fed half wave. Things are also looking pretty good to the west. We've got a fair number of stations scattered throughout what I'll call sort of the Rocky Mountain region and then down into Texas. We've even got a couple of stations down here in Central and South America that are hearing us. On the Delta loop, we're still getting into Europe, but not nearly the number of stations are hearing us. We've got a few in the Rocky Mountain area of the US, the one in Texas, but nothing to the south. The end-fed half wave seems to be doing pretty good into Europe on 10 meters as well. There's a bunch of stations over here in Central Europe that are hearing us, and then a handful on the west coast of the US as well. On the Delta Loop, the pattern is very similar. I'd say that there's a few less stations in Central Europe that are hearing us, and a few sort of outliers that we saw on the ENFED half-wave that are not showing up on the Delta Loop. And then over here on the west coast of the US, the story is about the same. Most of the stations that heard us on the ENFED are hearing us on the Delta Loop, but a few are not. It looks like the transmit tests with the new antenna orientation are similar to what we saw the first time around. Now we are seeing a little bit of a different pattern than what we saw the first time around, but just like with the receive, that's sort of to be expected since we changed the orientation of the antennas. And once again, throughout the transmit test, it looks like the ENFED half-wave is maybe 25% better than the Delta Loop in most cases. But just like before, it seems like there's always a few stations that can hear us on the Delta Loop that couldn't on the ENFED half-wave. And again, that could be attributable to different patterns in the antenna or just band conditions at the exact time the test was conducted. Now that we've gone through all the tests, I think I've got a pretty good idea of how these two antennas perform relative to each other. It seems like in most cases, the ENFED half-wave outperforms the Delta Loop by maybe 10 to 20%. Although there are some instances on receive where the Delta Loop seemed to have a clear advantage over the ENFED half-wave. As we looked at earlier in the video, the Delta Loop is definitely not tuned quite as well as the ENFED half-wave is. And that could be contributing to some of the performance degradation we're seeing on the Delta Loop. Let's just hypothetically say for the moment that the tuning is causing the differences that we're seeing. And that if we were to tune the Delta Loop exactly the same way that the ENFED is tuned, we would see similar results. If that is the case, the Delta Loop is still not outperforming the ENFED. It's maybe equal to it. And given the fact that the Delta Loop is more complicated mechanically, especially in a portable situation, even with the configuration that I've come up to, it's probably not the best choice most of the time. Now, I mentioned it earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. My kind of idea behind creating the lazy Delta Loop was to create a Delta Loop antenna that was almost as easy to put up as an ENFED half-wave. Now, most of the time I've found that it takes maybe about 50% longer to set that up over the ENFED half-wave. I'm guessing that over time, and maybe with some better wire, it would be a little bit easier to put up. But it's still more complicated an antenna than the ENFED half-wave. And if we go back to our theoretical argument that says if both antennas were tuned equally, they would perform equally, I don't think the extra complication of the Delta Loop is going to be worth it in most situations. The only time I think it would be a clear advantage would be in a noisy environment where you needed a better receive antenna on maybe 40 or 20 meters. Then the Delta Loop might give you a little bit of an advantage over the ENFED half-wave, but again, the penalty is sort of the complexity of putting the antenna up. I'm not sure if a normal Delta Loop would outperform my lazy Delta Loop. In other words, if we added even more complexity to the mechanical structure of the antenna and set up a regular equilateral triangle Delta Loop, maybe that would outperform the ENFED half-wave. But would it be worth it? I think it depends on the type of activation that you're going to do. I had fun going through this test and kind of exploring these two antennas. I feel like I've learned a little bit more about antennas and propagation and how these two antennas work compared to each other. I hope you found some value in this video. Thanks for watching, and 7-3.